Hi guys, welcome back to another video. We're going to be trying to tackle quite a difficult part of the Tartaria narrative, which is something that I'm still not sure of myself today, and it's why I have not touched this subject yet on the channel. It's American Tartary or Tartarian America, and we're going to be looking at the possibility that Tartaria was in fact, at least in some part, in America. When it comes to Tartaria, this is definitely the most difficult place to find information about. If you look on YouTube or other blogs and forums, stolen history, I think most people will probably focus on the idea of buildings in America being older than they seem. Settlements and cities growing to have huge populations much faster than they should have done. Some people even suggest that things like the railroads were actually dug out instead of built, things like this. We're not going to be touching on any of that stuff. As you know, on this channel, we try to focus on what we can find in the historical data. We don't really try to touch too much on speculation or things that we can't find evidence for. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. Doesn't mean it did happen. It's just not what we do here.
We don't do that here.
We look for things that we can actually find evidence for, and then we talk about that. If you want to speculate on what might have happened as a result, or the consequences, then that's up to you. But we talk about what we can find. And this is something that, like I say, I have avoided for quite a while because the information out there is just so little, and I didn't want to provide something to you guys that was fantastical without being able to back any of it up. So, for example, on Stolen History, on their main article about Tartaria that was posted a good few years ago now, I think about 2020, one of my first videos was actually on this, but I ended up deleting it because at the time I really didn't have much knowledge on Tartaria, so I ended up deleting it because they do make a lot of mistakes in this, I must be honest. They do sometimes give you some good information, don't get me wrong, and definitely good sources and links. But yeah, anyway, so coming from Stolen History, this was their biggest article about Tartaria, and they made the claim in this map of 1652 that Tartary appears to have control over North America. And I'm not 100% sure on what the basis for that claim actually is. I've brought up the high quality of the map. I think the reason that they're suggesting that it's controlled by Tartary is because it's the same color, which is kind of ridiculous, because as we see, Europe is one color, South America is the same color. So are they trying to suggest that Europe and South America are the same team? I'm not really sure. Africa is obviously one color as well. So is the African continent a whole country? No. I think the whole reason that they're saying that it's part of Tartary is actually because it's coloured yellow, and so is Tartary. Although if you see the corner of Tartary here, it's green. If that is the reason, that's pretty stupid. I'm gonna be honest, because there's these two are the same colour, and they're definitely not one giant country. Africa isn't one giant country. We do see over here that we have some text written about America. So looking around, a lot of named places, but there's nothing that indicates any cities down there or anything. Over here as well, I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but it basically just talks about Columbus discovering it and then other people doing it afterwards. But notice that the date is actually 100 years incorrect, because Columbus discovered America in 1492. Rather curious, isn't it? That they seem to make that mistake. Got it out by a whole 100 years. Going back to Stolen History, don't worry, by the way, I will be showing you some decent evidence that could suggest that these things are different. Just going through this first. And then the other thing that they mention on American Tartary is, they do say the jury is still out on this, but there are some indicators that Tartary was present in the North American continent as well. There obviously are no official historical accounts, but some bits and pieces of info suggest just that. It goes against what they said before about that map seemingly showing the whole of North America being under Tartarian control, because it's just kind of ridiculous. But we're going to talk about the reality of it, because that's a bit of a nutcase claim, but we're going to talk about the reality. So the main things that they go off is this person that you may or may not have heard of called King Tartarax. And then there's also this map here, and it provides this source here from this book for the text. I wanted to see the map, because the map and the text are separate. He's just stuck the text over and he hasn't provided a source of the map. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at that text itself. And this book is by Josiah Priest from 1834. It's called American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, so you can check that out for yourself. And they've got a whole chapter here, the voyages and shipping of the Mongol Tartars and settlements on the western coast of America. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to come back to this book shortly, because there's something else that connects with it that I want to bring up first, because this goes into detail on that. So first we're going to have a look at a map. And whilst it's not quite the same, we can see with this one that we're trying to find that's got pink on this side, the green here, and the yellow down here in Hispania Nova. It's a similar thing. Hispania Nova here, you can see this area here. So maybe it is trying to suggest that this area is its own region. I think they're trying to suggest that this is Tartaria, and then obviously the Spanish come down here and the Europeans have come over from this side. So I think that's what they're trying to suggest, is that this is Tartarian. This map as well has a very similar thing going on about it. Once again, 1492, so they've got it correct on this map. But you can see that they've got this place called Quivera, which is connected to Tartarax, which we're going to talk about shortly. But yeah, it is, again, similar thing. Hispania Nova, this side here where we think the Europeans are coming, and then this, which is what they're suggesting, is the Tartarian sections. So it definitely wasn't control over the whole North American region. I think, if anything, it will have been the West Coast. It is actually important to remember that the main migrations of Native Americans are actually from Asia. The thing is, though, the official history will tell you, looking at this haplogroup map here, that they came over 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago. I think the most recent ones they'll say is about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But anything after that, they say it didn't happen, which is curious. Why were people able to cross these oceans 5,000 years ago, but they weren't able to do it 1,000 years ago? The original idea behind it is the frozen land bridge theory, that they were able to cross over the Bering Strait and then move south from there. Then you've also got them sailing around these islands up to Kamchatka and then going across that way. But that also can fit in with the land bridge theory because of the lower water levels are 150 meters lower at one point. But then we have this one down here, which is evidently a water crossing. And they admit that 5,000 years ago people did cross over to America on boats. So King Tartarax essentially comes from this story to do with our Spanish adventurers that were looking for gold. This man here, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, and essentially what it was having a look for the 7 cities of Cibola, the 7 cities here. And the 7 cities corresponded to El Dorado, Paititi, City of the Caesars, Lake Parima, Manoa, Antilia, and Quivera. Today it's located around the Arkansas River in central Kansas, that's what they say anyway, and it was not a city of gold, and it was just a community of Wichita people. That's the official thing. So where do the stories come from? Well, from one of the historians, one of the expeditions, it says, in the year 1530, Nuno de Guzman, who was president of New Spain, had in his possession an Indian, one of the natives of the valley of Oxapampa, who was called Tejo by the Spaniards. This Indian said he was the son of a trader who was dead, but that when he was a little boy, his father had gone into the back country with fine feathers to trade for ornaments, and that when he came back, he brought a large amount of gold and silver, of which there is a good deal in that country. He went with him once or twice, and saw some very large villages, which he compared to Mexico and its environment. He had seen 7 very large towns which had their streets of silver workers. And there were also reports given by 4 shipwreck survivors of the failed Narvaez expedition, which included this fellow here, another Spanish explorer, as well as a Moorish slave named Esteban Dorantes. And when they returned to New Spain, the adventurers said that they'd heard stories from the natives about cities with great and limitless riches. So when we talk about the lost cities of gold, this is definitely connected. And of course, the official history is that when Coronado and his other adventurers arrived at Cibola in 1540, they couldn't find any gold, and it turned out all the stories had been made up. See, from this map here of the Coronado expedition, we can see where he supposedly went and where he found out that it was all nonsense. The forum also provides a load of other pictures that show Quivera and its different locations that we're just going to have a quick peek at. This one here showing it on this corner. Here again, it reminds us that 1492 Christopher Columbus discovered America. Some of these are pretty bad quality, but again, it's over on this left-hand side. You can see they did believe it to be somewhere called the Anian Strait, so that's what they called the Bering Strait before, and they believed it was a lot more south than it actually is. But interestingly, which kind of goes against this this whole notion, if you read this here, it says the indigenous of this region, after the manner of the Tartars, live in tents, having no cities. One more showing Quivera on the left, 1492 again, so it is quite interesting that that one thought it was 1592. I should probably let it go, but another one here, and again, this one says a similar thing in the corner. Here the people in groups through the plains, in company in that way, in tents, after the manner of the Tartars, and they lead a rustic life. So, pretty poor English there, but basically the people here, they live in groups, and just like the Tartars, they live in tents and lead a nomadic lifestyle, is what they're trying to suggest. And this one again, this one making it appear much more like Alaska or something, in my opinion. Looking, circle of Antarctica up here, looking way further north, because people hypothesized that it was down near California, possibly. And then, of course, looking inland, but Quivira definitely looking like it's on the coast. So that journey that they took, the expedition inland, no wonder they didn't find it, because I would say this looks more like Northwest America, getting much further up towards Alaska, which would make sense because of the migratory route that they would have taken over the Bering Strait. And another final picture. So yeah, you can see up here, we've got China, Cathay, the Mongol areas, missing quite a bit of Siberia. And that's because they just couldn't get up there. Don't forget, the Russians didn't make it to the edge of Kamchatka till about 1690. It was only after 1690 that you're ever going to see a map showing Kamchatka properly. By the official history, anyway. Up to you if you want to believe that. We can see this text talking about Quivira, saying the many different lost cities like Atlantis, lost continent of Mu, Kublai Khan, Xanadu, and it's basically saying the 7 cities of Kabul and Quivira, they fall into the same category. It says it's a city born in the mind of Coronado's conquistadors through their greed for gold. The kingdoms of Quivira and Anian are located on maps of Western America, but they had no more existence in reality than Thor's Valhalla or the abode of the Olympian gods. That is the official line for Quivira, that these guys didn't exist. And before we move off of King Tartarax into the actual Mongol Tartar movements into America, we do have some decent stuff to look at, by the way, so make sure you do stick around. We're just going to have a look at this book, this Garden of the Gods, because I did find a mention of King Tartarax in here, which was quite cool. And it's just down here, Amateur Rodeo, 1910s, and it says, the 1910s brought an economic slump to the Colorado Springs. To offset this slump, some residents sought to draw tourist trade by staging a historical pageant about Indians and the 16th century activities of the conquistadors in New Mexico and of old King Tartarax of Quivira. So, King Tartarax of Quivira, obviously people point to the fact that Tartar Rax is like Tartar Rex, aka King of the Tartars. Tartar itself obviously sounds like Tartars. So that would be, King Tartar King. Obviously trying to suggest that it's a mistranslation, and it's essentially just the Latin for King Tartar of Quivira. And the final King Tartarax is just an article from 1889. It talks all about Coronado going to find Cibola with his team, trying to go to the legendary City of Gold. And we can see mentions of King Tartarax, that this realm of Quivira was ruled by the mighty monarch Tartarax, who lived in magnificent splendor, that gold was so common among these people as to be of little value, that they made utensils and farming implements, and that the monarch Tartarax and his subjects lived in splendor. Their warriors wore helmets and bore shields of gold. So yeah, this is apparently all in their heads. Somebody made this up and then they went looking for it, and it does mention Tartarax quite a bit. Just talking about the story, this is stuff that you can come and read for yourself if you want, because we don't need to go into it. It will just be talking about how they never found him. It is interesting that Tartarax was clearly a bigger part of the mythology in the 1800s, because most people won't hear about it now. And they're just talking about holding an event to basically stage the whole thing. King Tartarax, the Spanish, etc., etc. And it's what we saw in that last book that they were talking about, but a bit better than a rodeo. So just like the event in the 1910s that we saw in that book, The Garden of the Gods, they're talking about holding a similar event, and this guy's suggesting who they should have and play who characters and stuff. So it was, like I say, if they're doing it in the 1910s and there's something in the 1890s, it was clearly part of the local mythology up until that point, which would be quite sad if it's been erased from the local memory. That's just, I think that's our last mention of Tartarax, or there was one more book actually. The last one just brings up Tartarax again in the secret cities of South America, and it's talking about... It is also added as a memory of a great cataclysm that when Quetzalcoatl vanished, the sun and moon were covered in darkness and only a single star remained in the sky. Humboldt, in his Examen, says that the Franciscan monk Mark de Niza crossed the 37th parallel, a line linking California with Virginia, seeking a bearded King Tartarax who adored a golden cross and the image of a woman called the Lady of Heaven, which usually would suggest Mary. So this next book that we're going to come to is The Great Events in the History of North and South America from the Alleged Discovery of the Continent by the Northmen in the 10th century to the present time. Now, of course, that's referring to Leif Erikson and the Northmen, the Viking-type people who came over in the 10th century rather than Christopher Columbus, and that is in 1851. So it is quite interesting that people were quite aware of Leif Erikson, yet we still have Columbus Day. Why not Erikson Day? Why we came to this book is just for one little mention down here. The book obviously is talking about the ways in which America could have been populated, and it says, Dr. Swinton, author of many parts of the universal history, after stating the different opinions of various authors who have advocated in favor of the dispersed people, the Phoenicians and other eastern nations, observes that therefore the Americans in general were descended from a people who inhabited a country not so far distant from them as Egypt and Phoenicia. One will, as we apprehended, readily admit. Now, no country can be pitched upon so proper and convenient for this purpose as the northeastern part of Asia, particularly Great Tartary, Siberia, and more especially the peninsula of Kamchatka. That probably was the tract through which many Tartarian colonies passed into America and peopled the most considerable part of the New World. So, of course, he's saying that right here, the Tartarian colonies, very interesting, Tartarian colonies passed into America. So 1851, they're trying to suggest that. And, of course, it was actually a widely accepted thing that the Indians were Tartars, which isn't as much of a generalized statement as you might think, because we actually classify humans into three types, essentially white, black, and brown. And the Mongoloid, is that race classification. Anybody from Asia is essentially classified as that. So the North Americans do fall under that category and that classification. Our next source is from the historical collections of the Indians in New England, and it's provided, I think, for the king at the time, Charles II, around the 1600s. We will see. So it'll be from Charles's collection. And this interesting bit down here. Secondly, another apprehension is that the original of these Americans is from the Tartars or Scythians that live in the northeast parts of Asia, which some good geographers conceive is nearly joined unto the northwest parts of America, and possibly a one continent, or at least separated by some narrow gulf. And they were correct, of course, with the Bering Strait. And the Bering Strait is so small. It's smaller than some crossings of the English Channel, some sections, and you can stop. You've got a pair of islands right in the middle that you can stop on and then make the next leap of the journey. You could do it in a canoe very easily. But it goes on to just talk about how they are very like the Scythian people in colour, shape, and manners. But it does actually say about sheep, horses, and camels and other tame beasts that are not found in America among the Indians. So that literally is the question they pose there. They say, if this people be sprung from the Tartarian or Scythian people, as this nation asserts, so these people do seem to assert, I think the Indians themselves must have asserted it, then it is to me a question why they did not attend the known practice of that people, who, in all of their removes and plantations, take with them their kine, sheep, horses, and camels, and the like tame beasts. And of these sorts and kinds of beasts used by the Tartars, none were found in America among the Indians. This is it's a different version of the same document we saw earlier that just essentially says the same thing. Probably was the tract with which many of the Tartarian colonies passed into America, aka, through Kamchatka, from Great Tartary, Siberia. This is not to be denied. It's the most rational way of getting inhabitants into America, if it must be allowed that it was peopled from the Old World. So they're saying if the America was peopled from our world, because America's the New World, the Old World, then they must have come through there because it's the shortest distance, and that just makes sense. Another one going from about 1820, so yeah, it's the American Indian Origin Theories as of 1820 by Samuel Mitchell. We'll see the paper covers new ground in showing that Professor Samuel Mitchell, formerly of Columbia College, had concluded that two main groups of people once dominated the Americas, the Tartars of Northern Asia and the Australasians of the Polynesian Islands. Furthermore, they fought one another for many years, culminating in great battles of extermination in what later became upstate New York. This New York theory has much in common with the Book of Mormon. The book then carries on to talk about a rumor of a Portuguese Jew that went around, and of Antonio Montesinos, who claimed that he had been led of God to discover a holy people, a tribe of ancient Jews, in the mountains of Nueva Granada in 1641. Basing his claim on similarities of sacramental rites, customs, and languages between this group and those of ancient Jews. Many people of the day turned to the respected Rabbi Manasseh to confirm or reject him. Sensing this opportunity to advance the cause of his people, Manasseh ben Israel published in 1650 his famous Hope of Israel, in which he strongly argued in favor of the lost tribes in America, claiming that they had mingled with Tartaric or Asian tribes in ancient Scythia before coming to America. Presenting remarkably little hard or new evidence, he nevertheless capitalized upon the renewed controversy to show that God's ancient people, the Jews, had indeed been scattered and dispersed to the four quarters of the earth. Another man known as Antonio de la Calancha, writing in the early 17th century, also posited that the Indians had descended from the Tartars of Eastern Asia. Likewise, the great English observer Edward Brerewood advanced the Acostan tradition, arguing for a Tartarian origination via Alaska, since most Indians frequented the west coasts of the Americas. Other men during the same period, such as David Zeisberger, John Heckelwelder, Caspar Wistar, Pierre de Ponco, and Benjamin Smith Barton, all argued for the Tartaric origin of the Indians, for the Bering Strait theory, and for a common original language. In 1795, Professor Samuel Mitchell of Columbia College returned to his lifelong interest in the origins of the Indians, and he began to formulate his threefold interpretation of American Indian origins and history. Number one, that the three races of Malays, Tartars, and Scandinavians contributed to make up the American population. That the Tartars eventually overwhelmed and destroyed the other two races over a fairly long period of time. And finally, that the final battles of extermination were fought in upstate western New York, not too far from the south of Lake Ontario. Mitchell began teaching college classes in 1816, saying that both North and South America had been formerly populated fundamentally by two great races, not only the Hyperborean or inhabitants of the north, but also the Australasian or inhabitants of the south, the former Tartars and the latter Malays and Polynesians. So it's interesting to note that he is equating the northern people, the Tartars, with the Hyperboreans. His reason for claiming the North American Indians' ancestors were the Tartars were based on four factors: the similarity of their physical features, the affinity of their languages, the corresponding customs, and the kindred nature of American Indian dogs to those found in Siberia. Mitchell claims that all was going well with the Polynesian derivative of peoples until their confrontation with the encroaching Tartars. Colliding with both the Europeans and the more delicate race of Australasians, the Tartars overwhelmed and destroyed both peoples in a long series of terrible conflicts centered primarily in upstate New York. As China, Hindustan, Palestine, Greece, Italy, and the shores of Africa have been conquered by the swarms, which preceded numberless times, so have Canada, the regions bordering on the Missouri, the lakes, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the countries where New Spain and its intendancies now are, quite to Mexico, been subdued by hordes of savage adventurers from beyond the Arctic Circle. He went on to ask, what has become of these Australasians? And answered, they have probably been overcome by the more warlike and ferocious hordes that entered our hemisphere from the northeast of Asia. These Tartars of the higher latitudes have issued from the great hive of nations and desolated, in the course of their migrations, the southern tribes of America, as they have done to those of Asia and Europe. The greater part of the present American natives are the Tartar stock, the descendants of the hardy warriors who destroyed the weaker Malays that preceded them. Mitchell's work was accepted by Uzziah Priest, whose work we've actually seen in this video, The American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, which was published in Albany, New York in 1833. Although providing for the inclusion of vestiges of the lost tribes in parts of ancient America via an ancient land bridge with Africa, Priest believed the Tartars, in Hun-like fashion, completely destroyed the more southerly people, who left behind some 3,000 burial mounds and fortifications in present-day Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The skeletons found in our mounds never belonged to a people like our Indians, he asserted. Their foreheads were low, cheekbones rather high. We think we ascertain the inhabitants to have been white, like the Europeans. Calling the more civilized people the Aries, he believed they were so exterminated by the Tartars or Scythians that but one member of the nation, a warrior, remained. That's quite interesting that they believed them to be white. The Welsh supposedly migrated as well to the New World in about 560 AD. supposedly under Prince Madoc. So that would be quite interesting. And they moved to the Ohio regions, and there's lots of evidence of the Welsh there. So that is quite curious. Maybe the Tartars were the ones that killed the Welsh in America. King Arthur himself was said to have sailed to the New World, where he was then killed by an Indian, by a native. And if that's a Tartar, that's a bit of a spin on the story. But we won't go into that today. So the next mention of American Tartary is actually rather curious. It's talking about America. It's a British letter. It's a letter going back to Britain. It's talking about the colonies. And they're talking about the cause of resistance. And it says the other cause of resistance is the prodigious expansion of the back settlements. Many of the people in the back settlements are already little attached to particular situations. They've already topped the Appalachian Mountains. From thence they behold before them an immense plain, one vast, rich, level meadow, a square of 500 miles. Over this they would wander, without a possibility of restraint. And surely, sir, it is impossible for us to restrain them. Undoubtedly, they will wander wherever they choose to do. They would soon change their manners with the habits of their life. They would soon forget a government by which they were disowned. They would become hordes of English Tartars, and pouring down upon your unfortified frontiers a fierce and irresistible cavalry, become masters of your governors and councillors, your collectors and controllers, and of all the slaves that adhered to them. So it's suggesting that the people that weren't living inside the colonies, the ones that had started moving west, they would become like the Tartars, and that they would destroy the colonies. And the response we get back is obviously, thanks, sir, thank you for these kind prophetic declarations. And down here it says, for indeed, whether the colony was placed in Asiatic or in American Tartary, the folly and absurdity of pretending to govern such a colony, and to make it subservient to the purposes of British commerce, would be just the same. Nature opposes it, as you justly observe, and nature will be obeyed. So they're saying, look, whether we put a colony in Asiatic or in American Tartary, it'll be the same. It'll be absurd because nature is against it. They're too far away and they'll destroy us. So it's very curious that they're calling American Tartary. That's the bit, is why are they calling it American Tartary? This is one of the only, if not the only mention properly of American Tartary that we can actually find. There's only a couple. If you'd like to find that book, by the way, there's actually a better version that you have to borrow, unfortunately, but you can borrow it for an hour. But you can find it on Internet Archive, Josiah Tucker, a selection from his economic and political writings. And you can find that section right there. That's up there. So if you want to find that for yourself, you can do. You can also come to this called The Ancient Chinese Account of the Grand Canyon or the Course of the Colorado. It's a 44-page book, so we will definitely not be reading it. But essentially, it goes into how the ancient Mexicans likened North America to a tree, a stupendous mulberry tree planted in the land known to us today as South America. The Chinese geographers or mythologists teach at a distance of 10,000 miles to the east, there is a land over 3,000 miles in width. Now, the land referred to as must be North America, and we know that North America reaches 3,000 miles in width from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And the Chinese accounts further call our eastern realm a Fusang, or mulberry. A mulberry land is there, say the Chinese. The mulberry land is here, say the Mexicans. Like the Mexicans, the Chinese sages declare that there is an enormous tree, the Fu, or helpful sang tree, in the eastern mulberry land, 3,000 miles wide. As just remarked, the Chinese call their enormous tree a sang, and the Mexicans call their tree a beb, both terms standing for the mulberry. Observe in Figure 2, and she's over here. At Tehantepec, a little west of Yucatan, our continent narrows down to a width of 100 miles. The Mexicans say that North America is a tree and that it has correspondingly an enormous trunk, which at Tehantepec measures 100 miles. Now, the Chinese writers declare that the enormous mulberry in the region east of the Flowery Kingdom has a trunk of 300 li, or 100 miles. A mulberry tree with a trunk of 300 li is there, say the Chinese. A mulberry tree with a trunk of 300 li is here, say the Mexicans. So you can already see the connections between the Fusang and the Chinese, and if you want to read this book for yourself, you can do. We might go into this for a video for itself because it is very interesting, but I just wanted to bring this up, this connection here. The Chinese clearly knew about America. And once again, if you'd like to read this, here it is. You can find it on archive.org. Very easy. It was published in 1913. Ancient Chinese Account of the Grand Canyon. So if you want to read that, go ahead and do so. Now, talking of Josiah Priest that we did before, we can see his what he says down here. As it respects some of the ancient nations who may have found their way hither, as into America, we perceive a strong probability that not only Asiatic nations, very soon after the flood, of course the biblical flood is what they believe in, but also all along the different eras of time, different races of men, Polynesians, Malays, Australasians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Israelites, Tartars, Scandinavians, Danes, Norwegians, Welsh, and Scottish have colonized different parts of the continent. And Uzziah Priest also believed that before the flood, America was actually the country of Noah. It was where the ark was erected, and it was possibly where giants were in the biblical references. This book, another source on, so it's just talking about Tartarians. In early 1541, Coronado set out to find it, told of new and even more dazzling stories of Quivera. To the northeast, there was a river 7 miles wide. Within its depths were huge fish as large as horses. Tartarax the ruler slept in a garden of roses under a tree with thousands of golden bells, and even the pots and pans were made of gold. So it's stuff. I think they're just trying to make it sound ridiculous, to be honest. But that's that. Again, if you want to find that, you can do. So this guy was traversing America, and when he got to this bit, so we'll read from here. This forest ends just before you reach the Wabash, and from thence to the Mississippi, a distance of 80 miles, all is prairie or meadow. Here commences the American Tartary, bearing in all respects a strong resemblance to the Asiatic. He describes it, and below says, in all these features we recognize a likeness to the ancient Tartary, which would be entire and complete, could we see its natives metamorphosed into horsemen. Obviously because the Indians were supposedly not the same level of horsemen as ancient Tartary. The reason that this is conflicting is because there are different documents printed of this same text. And in some of the texts, this word here, this one, has been replaced with an. So it says, here commences an American Tartary. So this is where the confusion will come in, because they'll say, oh no, he was saying it's an American Tartary, because it looks like Tartary. To him, he got there and he's like, wow, this to me just looks like Tartary. However, some texts will say the American Tartary, which, again, is it referring to the American Tartary, or is it the American Tartary that guy referred to? And that's all up for debate. So it's up to you to decide. I've not been able to decide for myself. It could be either way. I'm not sure which ones have come first, because obviously all the books are reprints. It's very confusing which one that is. Right, as far as texts go, this is actually the most interesting because it's just so left field. It's got some information that just doesn't really make sense, doesn't jive with what we know as history, and it's just kind of confusing. I'm not sure exactly why it's written this way, and I'll show you. So this is the book. If you want to find it, give it a pause and search for that. Or the easiest way to find it actually would just to be type in Hakata Tartary or something on Google. But if you really struggle, ask me and I'll post a link. So for reference, who Hakata is, by the way, Ogdai Khan. So once again, this book is talking about America. It mentions how all the areas of Tartary are on the same latitudes as America and it'd be easy to cross over. And of course it says, here too may be added that Asia hath no territory anywhere which may more easily with numerous colonies supply America than this part of Tartary, as well for the vastness of the country, to which no other can compare. As for the increasing of the inhabitants, who do not admire that according to Michaelan Lithauer, there is scarce a city in Tartary that boasted less than 1,000 temples. So wow, according to this Michaelan bloke, there aren't many cities in Tartary that have less than 1,000 temples. And to see Kanguista, which is Genghis Khan, first king of Tartary, Genghis, first king of Tartary, about the year 1200, in arms, and his successor Hokata, following his father's bloody footsteps, whilst he prepared his sons with 3 vast armies. The eldest son, Jatchi, marched westward with 30,000 horse. Batu, drew with as great an army towards the north, and Toglade, being the youngest, fell into the Moors country above Egypt. Now this is where it gets really weird. Hikata himself marched victoriously into the North America, subdued great parts of the Persian kingdom, and beat the Turks, led by the general Goniata with a great army. In 1241. It's saying that Hokata marched into North America. I've been able to find no other references whatsoever for this, but it's saying he marched into North America. He's saying he subdued the greatest parts of the Persian kingdom and beat the Turks. I don't think it's necessarily saying that those took place in North America, even though it could seem that way. You know, just by the process of the chronological layout, you'd think that he's gone into North America, then he's subdued the Persian kingdom, and then he's beat the Turks. I don't think it's saying that. I think it's saying that he did those 3 things separately. However, what a very strange thing to say that he went into North America. It carries on as Jacob Placensis and Benedictus Sarmat's, 2 monks sent by the Pope Innocent to Hecata witness. The great number of the Tartars or Scythians may appear by the several people spread far and near over Tartary. It mentions a load of them that I'm not going to bother listing, but it mentions a lot of the tribes like the Hyperborean, the Chimeri, the Georgi, the Sakuris, and it says what number would the inhabitants make up, that live in America. And again, it mentions some places like Virginia, Florida, New Spain, Guatemala, and it's saying what many of these would live there. It would be worth our time to compare the likeness between the Scythians and the Northern Americans. And yeah, it just goes on to talk about how they are very similar. But the most interesting thing, of course, being Hecata. Hecata marched into North America around 1241, according to this document. Once again, for reference, I came to this book just to make sure that, it talks about Hecata here. So it talks about Changus, and then chosen by his subjects, he caused Hecata, his eldest son, to be crowned king. So there's Hecata, and down here we can see Hecata, i.e. Ogadai or Octai. So we know who that is. Now, onto this book, which has some interesting information up here. We can see, in 1380, one of the naval squadrons of the great Tartar conqueror Kublai Khan, which sailed to invade Japan, was wrecked on the western coast of South America. The shipwrecked mariners thereupon, through some unspecified turn of the wheel of fortune, founded the Empire of Peru. And we'll return to this document, which is the one we talked about before, the Uzziah priest one with the Mongols and their appearing, because this one is, it mentions a little bit more in detail about that landing on Peru, just a little bit. And Uzziah priest is the one that we heard about, who based all his work on Mitchell, but it does have this information. So it says, a cross made of fine marble, beautifully polished, about 3 feet high and 3 fingers in width and thickness, was found in an Indian temple. This, it appears, was kept as sacred in a palace of one of the Incas and was held in great veneration by the natives of South America. When the Spaniards conquered that country, they enriched this cross with gold jewels and placed it in the Cathedral of Cusco. But how came this emblem of Christianity in America? There were in the service of the Mongols in the 13th century many Nestorians, a sect of Christians, which we've heard about before in the kingdom of Prester John, was supposedly a Nestorian kingdom founded in the northeast, and Genghis Khan had a war with Uncham, who controlled it, and obviously won, and then in some stories even married his daughter. The conqueror of the king of Eastern Bengal was a Christian, which was in 1272. Under this king, a part of an expedition was sent to conquer the islands of Japan. In large Chinese vessels, and supposed to have been commanded by these Christian Nestorians as officers, being more trustworthy and more expert in warlike maneuvers than the Mongol natives. This expedition by some means found their way from the Japan Islands, which are west from North America, to the coast of America in the same latitude, and landed at a place called in the Mexican language Culcan, opposite New California. And obviously Culcan, you can see where that might come from. And then it says in 1273, Kublai, as in Kublai Khan, a Mongol emperor, it appears, became master of all China. At that time they were in the possession of the knowledge of shipbuilding, so that vessels of enormous size were constructed by them. They were solidly and conveniently made as to carry elephants on the decks. The Peruvians had a tradition that many ages before their conquest by the Spaniards, there landed on their coast at St. Helens Point vessels manned with giants, having no beard, and were taller from their knees downward than a man's head, and they had long hair, which hung loose upon their shoulders, and that their eyes were wide apart and very big in other parts of their bodies. This description is supposed to be a description of the elephants and the riders blended into one animal. As they did in later years when the Spaniards rode on horses, they took them at first to be one animal. There remains not a doubt that the Mongol Tartars found their way from China to the west of America in shipping. The voyage is not so great as to render it impossible, as that a French vessel in the year 1721 sailed from China and arrived at a place called Val de Nandras on the coast in 50 days. The Phoenician letters were known among the Mongol nations. If therefore they found their way to South America, we at once account for the Phoenician characters found in caverns and cut into rocks of that country. A description of what is supposed a Chinese Mongol town to the west, called by themselves when first visited by the Spaniards Talameco, is exceedingly curious and situated on the bank of a river running into the Pacific from the territory now called Oregon, only 4 degrees south of Lake Erie and in longitude 87 or exactly west of Ohio in latitude. It was well built and contained 500 houses, some of which are large and show well at distance. So we'll leave that document there because there's so much to go through, and we'll probably cover it in another video if we remember to. But that is just collating all the evidence that, you know, it seems like Mongols and the Chinese definitely went into southern America and into Mexico and North America. That's definitely what it's looking like. This next document that I want to have a look at actually comes from a Pulp Fiction magazine, released in 1947, I believe. Yeah, 1947. So just once again, this is a Pulp Fiction magazine. It's still very interesting, but it's Pulp Fiction. Because this kind of text out of context, you could really use it for your own advantage. You could really help paint a false narrative with it. But it is Pulp Fiction. But the reason it's interesting is because what it says. In this person's story, which was printed in the magazine in 1947, they start talking about entering a room, and the character has entered this room, large room with a window overlooking the sea, and he sees a map on one of the walls, but such a map that they'd never seen. So it's a very large map, and it was a map of the world, but a world which was a combination of the ancient and the modern. And it says Macedonia and Greece rubbed elbows, one as large as the other. The United States was called American Tartary. Russia was the land of the Khan of Greater Russia. Siberia of Lesser Russia. Germany was called Teutonia. China bore its ancient name Cathay, and Japan was part of it. So I found that very curious that a fiction writer has come up with this. So they must have had some kind of information, unless they just it was pure chance. But I just found that really curious that they've put that in. So 1947. Can you imagine that map? American Tartary, Russia with the land of the Khan of Greater Russia and Lesser Russia with Siberia. So the Khan of Siberia, which that was a real thing, the Khanate of Siber. It fell in about 1584. So just to show you what I was talking about before when we looked at the document that said about here commences the American Tartary, bearing in all respects a strong resemblance to the Asiatic, if you remember that. Well, to show you what I meant, we come to this document, which was released at a similar time. This one is 1807. And this one, in fact, says it's essentially the same thing. From the Wabash to the Mississippi, a space of 80 miles. There are nothing but savannas. And in reality, here commences an American Tartary. An American Tartary. So you can see how if it's an instead of the American Tartary, then that can really change the context of what you're trying to say. So that's important that we remember that, because that simple word change can mean a big difference in what they're trying to suggest. Back to Uzziah Priest's book, and we can see this interesting thing here. It says, from all we can make out by observing the growth of timber with that which is decayed, as found on the deserted works of the West, we are inclined to believe that about the same period of time when Europe was overrun by the northern hordes, that the region now called the United States, where the ancient inhabitants had fixed their abode, was also overrun by northern hordes from towards Bering Strait, who had in ages before got across from Asia, the Tartars or Scythians, and had multiplied, and as they multiplied, progressed farther and farther southerly, till they discovered an inhabited country, populous and rich, upon whom they fell with all the fury of Attila and the Huns. So we can only assume that that's suggesting when the northern hordes, as in the golden hordes, were falling upon Europe around the 12 to 1300s, that the hordes that were placed in the Alaskan regions and had crossed into the northern parts of Canada and moved south, they actually started moving south now, and they fell upon the inhabitants of America. That's actually seems to be suggesting this is a recent thing. This is why it's debatable. Europe has been overrun a couple times by hordes, so you could suggest that it's actually talking about the hordes of Attila the Hun, as it mentioned here, in which case that would put it at about 400 500 AD. However, it could be talking about the Mongol hordes, which did overrun parts of Europe, although it didn't overrun all of Europe, so possibly that's it. As the Tartars have overrun China, so the Aztecs subdued Mexico. As the Huns and Alans desolated Italy, so the Chippewas and the Iroquois prostrated the populous settlements on both banks of the Ohio. The surviving race in these terrible conflicts between the different nations of the ancient native residents of North America is evidently that of the Tartars. This article, coming from the New York Weekly Museum from 1817, we can see up here, it says, domestic manufactures, the pieces of goods prepared by the American Tartars and presented to Dr. Mitchell by Captain Richard Whitley, late of the US Army, are full of instruction. So American Tartars, quite interesting. It goes on to talk about Tartars and some other references to them, like over here. It brings up what we talked about before with Dr. Mitchell and his points about the Tartars. So that just shows in 1817, it's in this newspaper, talks about the more cultivated Malays who peopled from southern parts of North America, form the famous records discovered in New Spain. The ruder Tartars who migrated to the northern regions of the same continent are the authors of the fabrics, not less curious, but in a totally different style, now under consideration. It also talks about how the Indian wigwams, after the manner of the Tartars, are circular and not square. We can see from this book here the journey through Russia and Siberia from 1787 to 1788, but it was republished in 1966. He calls them American Tartars. They have been a long time Tartars, and it will be a long time before they are any other kind of people. The yurt, or hut as we generally call it, or as the American Tartars call it, the wigwam, is in this country a substitute for a tent. So a yurt, of course, was the tent specifically used by the Mongols. In fact, the city of Tenduk, we saw Tenduk on a map before, that's actually named after the Tenduk that's found in the center of a yurt, the skylight essentially in the middle, where you can pray through, because you'd pray to your god Tengri there, and that's called a Tenduk. I have a video about that if you want to learn more. The Asiatic, like the American Tartars, never change their dress. They are all the same on all occasions, in the field, in the house, on a visit, at the most dirty work, on a holy day. It is all the same, and they have never but one dress. It is very remarkable that both the Asiatic and American Tartars have the same caste or superstitious notions of women during their menstrual illness that Laban had in omitting to search for his silver gods when hid under Rachel, who feigned the menstruals. Very curious indeed. If we come to this book here, and once again, if you guys want to see any of the books, the reason I show you is so you can pause the video and then type this in and you'll go and find it. We can see at the bottom here, it says, if the tradition that men clothed in silk were seen at Quivira be well-founded, Hindus or Chinese or Japanese have mixed with the American Tartars. The Mexican and Peruvian kings, their almanacs and palanquins have come from Asia, as certainly as the Japanese in a later age have peopled the Kuril Islands, and the Moguls of a very remote age, Kamchatka. A different document here that we're looking at, Voyages of the Self, Pairs, Parallels and Patterns in American Art and Literature. Once again, Henry Nash Smith long ago reminded us that a writer in the Portfolio, I like that, Portfolio, in 1817 referred to the Northern Plains Indians as the American Tartars, whilst Timothy Flint spoke of the Southwest Indians as ruthless red Tartars of the desert. This book coming from 1851, The Bible and Civil Government in Course of Lectures, we can see it says here, the illustrious Burke, the unrivaled prophet of politics, as he is sometimes called, described many years ago a crowd of American Tartars armed with the pike and the saber, pouring from the west over the Alleghanies, and sweeping away the wealth and population of our eastern cities, grown indolent and defenseless by the natural course of popular government and profligate prosperity. So that's saying some American Tartars came pouring from the west, so obviously referring to Indians as American Tartars, flooding over to the west, and they swept away wealth and population from some of the eastern cities. This one, from 1848, it says, Mr. Thorpe, upon authority of Colonel Donovan, thus alludes to this tribe of American Tartars. The Navajo Indians are a warlike people, have no towns, houses, or lodges. They live in the open air or on horseback, and are remarkably wealthy, having immense herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. They are celebrated for their intelligence and good order. They treat their women with great attention, consider them equals, and relieve them from the drudgery of menial work. They are handsome, well-made, and in every respect a highly civilized people, being as a nation of a higher order of beings than the mass of their neighbors, the Mexicans. And this one from around 1848-ish, it's another Massachusetts Quarterly Review, so again, reviewing books. I think this was reviewing a historical book that was released. So it goes, our people is the most singular people under the heavens. They are ready to run anywhere and to run through everything. This Antony, gyrating about these pampas, now exhibiting a magic lantern to keep himself from starving, with my friend Crosby, at another moment in a retreat like a whirlwind, with whole hordes of South American Tartars after his emaciated skeleton, next thing slumping into a dirty dungeon, tomorrow strapping it across the dizzy heaven-kissing Cordilleras. I'm going to be honest, that felt like I was just reading the scribblings of a madman, but the fact that it mentions South American Tartars is rather curious, because again, connected to the Peruvian kingdom. Did the Tartars go over like we've heard? It's very possible. And finally, absolutely nothing to do with actual American Tartars, but in 1938 I find it quite interesting that there was a synthetic organic chemical company actually called American Tartars Corp. So yeah, I thought that was quite cool, actually called American Tartars Corp. The weird things you come across, eh? But anyway, I think I'll call that the end of the video because it's been quite a long one. We've gone into almost every American Tartarian document I can find. We did have some that we could delve deeper into, which I think we might have to in separate videos, but I think we tackled that well today, and I'd love to hear your opinions down below. What do you think was going on there? I think, my personal opinion, I think it's likely that the Chinese were moving over to America quite often. I think if ancient people were making those journeys on boats, I think the Chinese were very clearly able to do it. The ancient Chinese, we saw the Fusang, they're talking about it. We know the Tartars had a navy. There's stories about Hakata apparently going to North America. That's possible. Maybe it was the Quivera. Maybe we're talking about Alaska. Maybe they crossed over there. I'm not exactly sure. But I think the evidence does suggest that people in the 1800s, at least, definitely believed that the Indians were connected to the Tartars. A lot of learned people do believe that. DNA-wise, they do descend from the same people, but again, they say thousands of years ago. They say there haven't been any crossings since. I think the most recent crossings would be, circa 5,000 years ago, something like that. But why wouldn't they have been able to do it since that? It doesn't really make sense. So whether Kublai Khan's men did land in Peru and form the Peruvian Empire? Maybe. Are the Aztecs connected? Maybe. Was there a West Coast kingdom of Tartars? And then, of course, we heard about the Tartars that were fighting against the Malays and apparently wiped them out in America and then just became the dominant force. So what do you guys think to that? I really want to know your opinions down in the comments below, because I put a lot of time into this research, so I'd really like to hear everyone's opinion on it. It's by no means finished, so if you've got any information that you want to share, great, get it to me, and I'll put it in a video if it's any good. But anyway, if you stayed to the end, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Appreciate all the support you guys give. If you could make sure you subscribed and hit that notification bell, because first, YouTube likes to unsubscribe people, and second, you won't get notified when my videos come out sometimes. So you've got to make sure you do that. If you would like to support the channel, there are a few things you can do. You can buy me a coffee, you can subscribe to the Patreon, you can join the channel memberships on the YouTube, and if you do join the Patreon, you can get access to the Discord server, which is where I post all my research. So when I'm doing all my research, I post all the links in there, and you can talk to us, discuss theories, get involved in the research if you want, and it helps support the channel. So for everyone that already does, thank you very much. You guys are the best. And if you don't feel like supporting, then like and subscribe keeps us happy. So thank you very much, and I'll catch you on the next episode.